gesticulated convulsively. He proceeded to step as though I had threatened him. I made a bolt through them into the hotel. I charged back into the coffee room, rang the bell furiously. I gripped the waiter as he entered. "Do you hear?" I shouted. "Get help and carry these bars up to my room right away."
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving. We had a pretty good Thanksgiving over here. Hope you guys did too. I listened to the audiobook of First Man in the Moon. My days went pretty good. Pretty good. Okay, so today I'm going to do Tamar. And yeah, Tamar. Yeah. The cats we've been taking care of have been to so many people's houses. When they came back, their bellies was literally dragging on the floor because they eating everybody Thanksgiving food, okay? I don't know what to say about it. But I'm going to use my marker. I'm going to use my marker.
At last I was calm enough to get out of bed and ring up the round-eyed waiter for a flannel nightshirt, soda and whiskey, and some good cigars. And these things being procured me after an exasperating delay that drove me several times to the bell. I locked the door again and proceeded very deliberately to look the entire situation in the face. The net result of the great experiment presented itself as an absolute failure. It was a rout, and I was the sole survivor. It was an absolute collapse, and this was the final disaster. There was nothing for it but to save myself as much as I could in the way of prospects from our debacle. At one fatal crowning blow, all my vague resolutions of return and recovery had vanished. My intention of going back to the moon,
the only time they need supplies is when I'm trying to.
Having a fragment of catarite analyzed.
The only time, literally, look like the only time they need something is when I get to drawing. So
all these ideas vanished altogether. I was the sole survivor, and that was all.
Let's get started. Just say the talking, just gonna get started.
One of the luckiest ideas I have ever had in an emergency. I really believe I should either have got loose-headed or done some indiscreet thing. But there, locked in and secure from all interruptions, I could think out the position and all its bearings and make my arrangements at leisure. Of course, it was quite clear to me what had happened to the boy. He had crawled into the sphere, meddled with the studs, shut the catarite windows, and gone up. It was highly improbable he had screwed the manhole stopper, and even if he had, the chances were 1,000 to 1 against his getting back. It was fairly evident that he would gravitate with my bales to somewhere near the middle of the sphere and remain there, and so cease to be a legitimate terrestrial interest. However remarkable he might seem to the inhabitants of some remote quarter of space. I very speedily convinced myself on that point. And as for any responsibility I might have in the matter, the more I reflected upon that, the clearer it became that if only I kept quiet about things, I need not trouble myself about that. If I was faced by sorrowing parents demanding their lost boy, I had merely to demand my lost sphere, or ask them what they meant. At first I had had a vision of weeping parents and guardians and all sorts of complications. But now I saw that I simply had to keep my mouth shut, and nothing in that way could arise. And indeed, the more I lay and smoked and thought, the more evident became the wisdom of impenetrability. It is within the right of every British citizen, provided he does not commit damage nor indecorum, to appear suddenly wherever he pleases, and as ragged and filthy as he pleases, and with whatever account of virgin gold he sees fit to encumber himself, and no one has any right at all to hinder and detain him in this procedure. I formulated that at last to myself, and repeated it over as a sort of private Magna Charta of my liberty. Once I had put that issue on one side, I could take up and consider in an equable manner certain considerations I had scarcely dared to think of before, namely, those issues arising out of the circumstances of my bankruptcy. But now, looking at this matter calmly and at leisure, I could see that I suppressed my identity by a temporary assumption of some less well-known name, and if I retained the 2-month spirit that had grown upon me, the risk of any annoyance from the spiteful creditor to whom I had already alluded became very small indeed. From that to a definite course of rational worldly action was plain sailing. It was all amazingly petty, no doubt, but what was there remaining for me to do? So we get all that down. Whatever I did, I was resolved that I would keep myself level. So what I'm gonna use is I'm gonna use the peach writing materials and addressed a letter and the brown. Romney Bank, the nearest, the waiter informed me. I think I can figure out her color without trying to mark it all out. An account with him and requesting him to send 2 trustworthy persons, properly authenticated, in a cab with a good horse to fetch some 100 weight of gold with which I happened to be encumbered. I signed the letter Blake, which seemed to me to be a thoroughly respectable sort of name. This done, I got a Folkestone blue book, picked out an outfitter, and asked him to send a cutter to measure me for a dark tweed suit. All right, so I'm gonna put this piece down first, and then I'll go back over it with the brown boots, shirts, hat to fit, and so forth. And you know what? Before I get started on there, let me do this. And these letters being dispatched, I had up as good as lunch as the hotel could give, and then lay smoking a cigar, as calm and ordinary as possible, until in accordance with my instructions 2 duly authenticated clerks came from the bank and weighed and took away my gold, after which I pulled the clothes over my ears in order to drown any knocking, and went very comfortably to sleep. I went to sleep. No doubt it was a prosaic thing for the first man back from the moon to do, and I can imagine that the young and imaginative reader will find my behavior disappointing. But I was horribly fatigued and bothered, and confound it, what else was there to do? There certainly was not the remotest chance of my being believed if I had told my story then, and it would certainly have subjected me to intolerable annoyances. I went to sleep. When at last I woke up again, I was ready to face the world as I have always been accustomed to face it since I came to years of discretion. And so I got away to Italy, and there it is I am writing this story. If the world will not have it as fact, then the world may take it as fiction. It is no concern of mine. And now that the account is finished, I am amazed to think how completely this adventure is gone and done with. Everybody believes that Cavour was a not very brilliant scientific experimenter who blew up his house and himself at Lympne, and they explained the bang that followed my arrival at Littlestone by a reference to the experiments with explosives that are going on continually at the government establishment of Lyd, 2 miles away. I must confess that this is the premiere of the piece, just to let y'all know. The disappearance of Master Tommy Simmons, which was that little boy's name. That perhaps may prove a difficult item of corroboration to explain away. They account for my appearance in rags with 2 bars of indisputable gold upon the Littlestone beach in various ingenious ways. It doesn't worry me what they think of me. They say I've strung all these things together to avoid being questioned too closely as to the source of my wealth. I would like to see the man who would invent a story that would hold together like this one. Well, they must take it as fiction. There it is. I have told my story, and now I suppose I have to take up the worries of this terrestrial life again. Even if one has been to the moon, one has still to earn a living. So I am working here at Amalfi on the scenario of that play I sketched before Cavour came walking into my world, and I am trying to piece my life together as it was before ever I saw him. I must confess that I find it hard to keep my mind on the play when the moonshine comes into my room. It is full moon here. Okay, so I got the piece down. And I think I want to add some yellow to it. So much. Imagine it. Tables and chairs and trestles and bars of gold. Confound it. If only one could hit on that Cavorite again. But a thing like that doesn't come twice in a life. Here I am, a little better off than I was at Limney, and that is all. And Cavour has committed suicide in a more elaborate way than any human being ever did before. So the story closes as finally and completely as a dream. It fits in so little
I'm using the crazy art yellow.
Life. So much of it is so utterly remote from all human experience. The leaping, the eating, the breathing, and these weightless times, that indeed there are moments when, in spite of my moon gold, I do more than half believe myself that the whole thing was a dream. End of chapter. Chapter 22 of The First Men in the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Chapter 22. The Astonishing Communication of Mr. Julius Wendigee. When I had finished my account of my return to the earth at Littlestone, I wrote "The End," made a flourish, and threw my pen aside, fully believing that the whole story of the first men in the moon was done. Not only had I done this, but I had placed my manuscript in the hands of a literary agent, had permitted it to be sold, had seen the greater portion of it appear in the Strand magazine, and was setting to work again upon the scenario of the play I had commenced at Limney before I realized that the end was not yet. And then, following me from Amalfi to Algiers, there reached me, it is now about 6 months ago, one of the most astounding communications I have ever been fated to receive. Briefly, it informed me that Mr. Julius Wendigee, a Dutch electrician, who has been experimenting with certain apparatus akin to the apparatus used by Mr. Tesla in America, in the hope of discovering some method of communication with Mars, was receiving day by day a curiously fragmentary message in English, which was indisputably emanating from Mr. Cavour in the moon. At first, I thought the thing was an elaborate practical joke by one who had seen the manuscript of my narrative. I answered Mr. Wendigee jestingly, but he replied in a manner that put such suspicion altogether aside, and in a state of inconceivable excitement, I hurried from Algiers to the little observatory upon the Monte Rosa in which he was working. In the presence of his record and his appliances, and above all of the messages from Cavour that were coming to hand, my lingering doubts vanished. I decided at once to accept a proposal he made to me to remain with him, assisting him to take down the record from day to day, and endeavoring with him to send a message back to the moon. Cavour, we learned, was not only alive, but free, in the midst of an almost inconceivable community of these ant-like beings, these ant-men.
Okay, so I got that down.
Darkness of the lunar
now we'll get the
it seemed, but otherwise
lacing
in quite
stuff
good
and
health.
lacing things over
In
here.
better health, he distinctly said, than he usually enjoyed on Earth. He had had a fever, but it had left no bad effects. But curiously enough, he seemed to be laboring under a conviction that I was either dead in the moon crater or lost in the deep of space. His message began to be received by Mr. Wendigee when that gentleman was engaged in quite a different investigation. The reader will no doubt recall the little excitement that began the century, arising out of an announcement by Mr. Nikola Tesla, the American electrical
I'm going to use my crazy art toasted toffee
His announcement renewed
because
attention
this is my
to
favorite
fact
color,
that
burn
had long been familiar to scientific people, namely, that from some unknown source in space, waves of electromagnetic disturbance, entirely similar to those used by Signor Marconi for his wireless telegraphy, are constantly reaching the Besides Tesla, quite a number of other observers have been engaged in perfecting apparatus for receiving and recording these vibrations, though few would go so far to consider them actual messages from some extraterrestrial sender. Among that few, however, we must certainly count Mr. Quincy. Ever since 1898, he had devoted himself almost entirely to the subject, and being a man of ample means, he had erected an observatory on the flanks of Monte Rosa, in a position singularly adapted in every way for such observations. My scientific attainments, I must admit, are not great, but so far as they enable me to judge, Mr. Wendigee's contrivances for detecting and recording any disturbances in the electromagnetic conditions of space are singularly original and ingenious. And by a happy combination of circumstances, they were set up and in operation about 2 months before Cavour made his first attempt to call up the Earth. Consequently, we had fragments of his communication even from the beginning. Unhappily, they are only fragments, and the most momentous of all the things that he had to tell humanity, the instructions, that is, for the making of Cavorite, if indeed he ever transmitted them, have thrown themselves away unrecorded into space. We never succeeded in getting a response back to Cavour. He was unable to tell, therefore, what we had received or what we had missed, nor indeed did he certainly know that anyone on Earth was really aware of his efforts to reach us, and the persistence he displayed in sending 18 long descriptions of lunar affairs, as they would be if we had them complete, shows how much his mind must have turned back towards his native planet since he left it 2 years ago. You can imagine how amazed Mr. Wendigee must have been when he discovered his record of electromagnetic disturbances interlaced by Cavour's straightforward English. Mr. Wendigee knew nothing of our wild journey moonward, and suddenly, this English out of the void. It is well the reader should understand the conditions under which it would seem these messages were sent. Somewhere within the moon, Cavour certainly had access for a time to a considerable amount of electrical apparatus, and it would seem he rigged up, perhaps furtively, a transmitting arrangement of the Marconi type. This he was able to operate at irregular intervals, sometimes for only half an hour or so, sometimes for 3 or 4 hours at a stretch.
Okay, so I get all that down. Now I want to do some shading.
Regardless of the fact that the relative position of the moon and points upon the Earth's surface is constantly altering.
And lightly shade certain areas of her body.
And of the necessary imperfections of our recording
right here.
His communication comes and goes in our records in an extremely fitful manner. It becomes blurred. It fades out in a mysterious and altogether exasperating way. And added to this is the fact that he was not an expert operator. He had partly forgotten, or never completely mastered, the code in general use, and as he became fatigued, he dropped words and misspelled in a curious manner. Altogether, we have probably lost quite half of the communications he made, and much we have is damaged, broken, and partly effaced. In the abstract that follows, the reader must be prepared, therefore, for a considerable amount of break, hiatus, and change of topic. Mr. Wendigee and I are collaborating in a complete and annotated edition of the Cavour record, which we hope to publish, together with a detailed account of the instruments employed, beginning with the first volume in January next. That will be the full and scientific report, of which this is only the popular transcript. But here we give at least sufficient to complete the story I have told, and to give the broad outlines of the state of that other world so near, so akin, and yet so dissimilar to our own. End of chapter.
Okay, so we got that down. Next thing I want to do is grab the white, the premier color white, and put it on certain parts of her body.
The First Men in the Moon. This This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina.
Okay, so I'm going to go over her
First Men and
forehead
the Moon by
with
H.G.
it.
Wells, Chapter 23, an abstract of the 6 messages first received from
Nose
Mr.
line.
Cavour.
Go around her nose all the way down.
The 2 earlier messages
Cheeks.
of Mr. Cavour may very well be reserved for that larger
Either
volume.
will come back at
They
her cheeks
simply tell,
again.
with greater brevity and
Other
with a
cheek.
difference in several details that is interesting, but not of any vital
Lip.
importance. The bare facts of the making of the sphere and our departure from the world. Throughout,
Chin.
Cavour speaks of me as a man who is dead, but with a curious change of temper as he approaches our landing on the moon. Poor Bedford, he says of me, and this poor young man. And he blames himself for inducing a young man, by no means well equipped for such adventures, to leave a planet on which he was indisputably fitted to succeed on so precarious a mission. I think he underrates the part my energy and practical capacity played in bringing about the realization of his theoretical sphere. We arrived, he says, with no more account of our passage through space than if we had made a journey of common occurrence in the railway train. And then he becomes increasingly unfair to me. Unfair indeed.
Okay, so we got that part
down.
down.
Expected in a man trained in the search for truth. Looking back over my previously written account of these things, I must insist that I have been altogether juster to Cavour than he has been to me. I have extenuated little and suppressed nothing, but his account is, it speedily became apparent that the entire strangeness of our circumstances and surroundings, great loss of weight, attenuated but
I'm
highly
going to use the
oxygenated
Premiere
air,
color
consequent exaggeration of the
Newberry.
results of muscular effort,
And I'm going to
rapid
lightly go
development
around
of
her
weird
cheek
plants
with it.
from obscure spores, lurid sky, was exciting my companion unduly. On the moon, his character seemed to deteriorate. He became impulsive, rash, and quarrelsome. In a little while, his folly in devouring some gigantic vesicles and his consequent intoxication led to our capture by the Selenites, before we had had the slightest opportunity of properly observing their ways. He says, you observe, nothing of his own concession to these same vesicles. And it goes on from that point.
This is the crazy art brown.
We came to a difficult
Okay, so now we're going to get the
for mistaking certain gestures of theirs,
crazy art white and just smooth everything out as best I could build, best of your ability and my ability. So
subsequently we fought with a number who endeavored to bar our way and slew 7 or 8 more. It says much for the tolerance of these beings that on my recapture I was not instantly slain. We made our way to the exterior and separated in the crater of our arrival to increase our chances of recovering our sphere. But presently I came upon a body of Selenites led by 2 who were curiously different, even in form. Many of these we had seen hitherto, with larger heads and smaller bodies, and much more elaborately wrapped about. And after evading them for some time, I fell into a crevasse, cut my head rather badly, and displaced my patella, and finding crawling very painful, decided to surrender, if they would still permit me to do so. This they did, and perceiving my helpless condition, carried me with them again into the moon. And of Bedford I have heard or seen nothing more. No,
I need to sharpen
nor,
this right
so
quick.
far as I can gather, any Selenite. Either the night overtook him in the crater, or else, which is more probable, he found the sphere, and desiring to steal a march upon me, made off with it. Only, I fear, to find it uncontrollable, and to meet a more lingering fate in outer space. And with that, Cavour dismisses me and goes on to more interesting topics. I dislike the idea of seeming to use my position as his editor to deflect his story in my own interest, but I am obliged to protest here against the turn he gives these occurrences. He said nothing about that gasping message on the blood-stained paper in which he told, or attempted to tell, a very different story. The dignified self-surrender is an altogether new view of the affair that has come to him, I must insist, since he began to feel secure among the lunar people. And as for the stealing the march conception, I'm quite willing to let the reader decide between us on what he has before him. I know I am not a model man. I've made no pretense to be. But am I that? However, that is the sum of my wrongs. From this point I can edit Gabor with an untroubled mind, for he mentions me no more. It would seem the Selenites who had come upon him carried him to some point in the interior down a great shaft, by means of what he describes as a sort of balloon. We gather from the rather confused passage in which he describes this, and from a number of Jen's allusions and hints and other and subsequent messages, that this great shaft is one of an enormous system of artificial shafts that run, each from what is called a lunar crater, downwards for very nearly 100 miles towards the central portion of our satellite. These shafts communicate by transverse tunnels.
Need to take a break for a moment.
Caverns and expand into great globular places. The whole of the moon's substance for 100 miles inward, indeed, is a mere sponge of rock. Partly, says Cavour, this sponginess is natural, but very largely it is due to the enormous industry of the Selenites in the past. The enormous circular mounds of the excavated rock and earth it is that form those great circles about the tunnels, known to earthly astronomers, misled by a false analogy, as volcanoes. It was down this shaft they took him, in this sort of balloon he speaks of, at first into an inky blackness, and then into a region of continually increasing phosphorescence.
Trying to get myself situated. Okay, so I'm finished with that. Now I need to do around her eyes. I'm gonna get
no doubt containing some phosphorescent organism that flowed ever more abundantly downward towards the central sea. And as
I'm gonna lightly put the Premier Art dark black around her eyes, lightly.
And at last, far below him, he saw, as it were, a lake of heatless fire, the waters of the central sea, glowing and eddying in strange perturbation, like luminous blue milk that is just on the boil. This lunar sea, says Cavour in a later passage, is not a stagnant ocean. A solar tide sends
now I'm get my crazy art white to try to blend it out.
Strange storms and boilings and rushings of its waters occur, and at times cold winds and thunderings that ascend out into the busy ways of the great anthill above. It is only when the water is in motion that it gives out light.
Now I'll get my Premier color black and color in her eyes.
Its waters rise and fall in an oily swell, and flakes and big rafts of shining, bubbly foam drift with the sluggish, faintly glowing current. The Selenites navigate its cavernous straits and lagoons in little shallow boats of a canoe-like shape. And even before my journey to the galleries about the Grand Lunar, who is master of the moon, I was permitted to make a brief excursion on its waters. The caverns and passages are naturally very tortuous.
Get my crazy art white,
sort of pilots among the fishermen, and not infrequently Selenites are lost forever in their labyrinths. In their remoter recesses, I am told, strange creatures lurk, some of them terrible and dangerous creatures that all the science of the moon has been unable to exterminate.
Dark brown again, and just the Premier color dark brown, and lightly go underneath her eyes.
Mass of clutching tentacles that one hacks to pieces only to multiply. And the sea, a darting creature that is never seen, so subtly and suddenly does it slay. He gives us a gleam of
And now I'm
description.
going to get the crazy art white
I was
again.
reminded on this excursion of what I have read of the Mammoth Caves. If only I had had a yellow flambeau instead of the pervading blue light.
Okay,
And a
so I got that down.
with an oar instead of
Now
a
what I'm going to do is her
working an
lips.
engine at the back of the canoe.
She was wearing, look like peach on her lip. Seemed like everybody always wanted to wear peach.
Were very various.
The only one who really wore
Sometimes black,
that had did
sometimes
wore something
pale blue
different
and
was
paint.
Nicki
And once they
Minaj,
flashed and glittered as though we had come into a line of
Mary J.
sapphires.
Blige, Rihanna.
And
They
below one
don't
saw the
see,
ghostly phosphorescent fishes
all this
flash
peach.
and vanish in the hardly less phosphorescent deep. Then
So let's take this peach and go fill it in.
Down the turgid stream of one of the channels of traffic, and a landing stage, and then perhaps a glimpse up the enormous crowded shaft of one of the vertical ways.
Okay, so now I'm gonna get a little.
In one great place heavy with glistening stalactites, a number of boats were fishing. We went alongside one of these and watched the long-armed selenites.
I'm gonna take this deep raspberry to add a little more color to it, and just go around her lips with it.
Short, bandy legs and crinkled face masks. As they pulled at it, that net seemed
add a little color to it.
Upon in the moon. It was loaded with weights, no doubt of gold, and it took a long time to draw. For in those waters, the larger,
now I'm gonna get this Premier cut, not Premier, but Crazy Art White.
The fish in the net came up like a blue moonrise, a blaze of darting, tossing blue. Among their catch was a many tenticulate, evil-eyed black thing.
Okay, so I got that done out the way. Now she had brown on her eyebrows, so we're gonna fill it in with the brown.
They hacked to pieces by means of little hatchets. All its dissevered limbs continued to lash and writhe in a vicious manner. Afterwards, when fever had hold of me, I dreamt again and again of that bitter, furious creature rising so vigorous and active out of the unknown sea.
Now I'm going to use the Premier color, dark brown, again, and just fill it in with the dark Premier color, dark brown.
The surface of the sea must be very nearly 200 miles, if not more, below the level of the moon's exterior. All the cities of the moon lie, I learnt, immediately above the central sea, in such cavernous spaces and artificial galleries as I have described, and they communicate with the exterior by enormous vertical shafts, which open invariably in what are called by earthly astronomers the craters of the moon.
Now I'm gonna get the Crazy Art White again, go over her eyebrows. No, just smooth it out.
Upon the condition of the less central portion of the moon, I have not yet arrived at very precise knowledge. There is an enormous system of caverns in which the moon calves shelter during the night, and there are abattoirs
now her hair.
and the like.
The first thing I want to put on her hair is I want to put the sunflower on her hair. The Crazy Art sunflower. So let's go ahead.
I have as yet scarcely learned as much of these things as a Zulu in London would learn about the British corn supplies in the same time. It is clear, however, that these vertical shafts and the vegetation of the surface must play an essential role in ventilating and keeping fresh the atmosphere of the moon. At one time, and particularly on my first emergence from my prison, there was certainly a cold wind blowing down the shaft, and later there was a kind of sirocco upward that corresponded with my fever. For at the end of about 3 weeks I fell ill of an indefinable sort of fever, and in spite of sleep and the quinine tabloids that very fortunately I had brought in my pocket, I remained ill and fretting miserably, almost to the time when I was taken into the presence of the Grand Lunar, who is master of the moon. I will not dilate on the wretchedness of my condition, he remarks,
okay, so
during those days of ill health. And he
once
goes
you got
on
to get
with
the
great
Premier
aptitude
Art
with
dark brown,
details
just
I
go
omit
over
here.
her.
My temperature, he concludes, kept abnormally high for a long time, and I
look like
lost all
that.
desire for food. I had stagnant waking intervals.
Now we'll get the yellow and go over with the yellow.
And at one phase I remember, so weak as to be earth-sick and almost hysterical.
This is the crazy art yellow, but I think I want to use the premier color yellow other than the crazy art yellow.
He reverts again presently to the topic of this sponge-caught lunar atmosphere. I'm told by astronomers and physicists that all he tells is in absolute accordance with what was already known of the moon's condition. Had earthly astronomers had the courage and imagination to push home a bold induction, says Mr. Wendigee, they might have foretold almost everything that Cavour has to say of the general structure of the moon. They know now pretty certainly that moon and earth are not so much satellite and primary as smaller
I got the premier art yellow.
Made out of one mass, and consequently made of the same material.
Now I'm not gonna just go all the way around with it. You know, I'm just gonna, because she had looked like two shades of yellow. I'm just going to add it. That's all. Just around. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my crazy art white and try to blend everything out with it.
But he certainly might have announced his knowledge of the hollowness of the moon before. And if the moon is hollow, then the apparent absence of air and water
but before I do that,
quite easily
I'm going to go over it with this orange, crazy art orange, to help tone it down. To help tone it down.
With simple physical laws. The caverns of the moon on the whole are very windy places. As the sunlight comes round the moon, the air in the outer
like I said, I'm not trying to blend anything. I'm just trying to go around with it.
With the evaporating air of the craters, where the plants remove its carbonic acid, while the greater portion flows round through the galleries to replace the shrinking air of the cooling side that the sunlight has left. There is, therefore, a constant eastward breeze in the air of the outer galleries.
Now I'm going to use my crazy art brown and lightly go around with it too.
By the varying shape of the galleries and the ingenious contrivances of the selenite mind. End of chapter.
This is just a regular brown.
Chapter 24 of The First Man in the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The First Man in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Chapter 24. The Natural History of the Selenites. The messages of Cavour from the 6th up to the 16th are for the most part so much broken, and they abound so in repetitions, that they scarcely form a consecutive narrative. They will be given.
Alright, so now I'm going to get my crazy art white and try to blend out her hair.
To abstract and quote as in the former chapter. We have subjected every word to a keen critical scrutiny, and my own brief memories and impressions of lunar things have been of inestimable help in interpreting what would otherwise have been impenetrably dark. And, naturally, as living beings, our interest centers far more upon the strange community of lunar insects in which he was living, it would seem, as an honored guest, than upon the mere physical condition of their world. I have already made it clear, I think, that the Selenites I saw resembled man in maintaining the erect attitude and in having 4 limbs, and I have compared the general appearance of their heads and the jointing of their limbs to that of insects. I have mentioned, too, the peculiar consequence of the smaller gravitation of the moon on their fragile slightness. Cavour confirms me upon all these points. He calls them animals, though of course they fall under no division of the classification of earthly creatures. And he points out the insect type of anatomy had, fortunately for men, never exceeded a relatively very small size on Earth. The largest terrestrial insects, living or extinct, do not, as a matter of fact, measure 6 inches in length. But here, against the lesser gravitation of the moon,
yeah, I think I'm gonna go over again with the
insect as vertebrate seems to have been able to attain to human and
brown, crazy art brown.
dimensions.
Oh, sorry for the camera.
He does not mention the ant, but throughout his allusions, the ant is continually being brought before my mind in its sleepless activity, in its intelligence and social organization, in its structure, and more particularly in the fact that it displays, in addition to the 2 forms, the male and the female form, that almost all other animals possess, a number of other sexless creatures, workers, soldiers, and the like, differing from one another in structure, character, power, and use, and yet all members of the same species. For these selenites also have a great variety of forms. Of course, they are not only colossally greater in size than ants, but also, in Cavor's opinion at least, in intelligence, morality, and social wisdom are they colossally greater than men. And instead of the 4 or 5 different forms of ant that are found, there are almost innumerably different forms of selenite. I had endeavored to indicate the very considerable difference observable in such selenites of the outer crust as I happened to encounter. The differences in size and proportions were certainly as wide as the differences between the most widely separated races of men. But such differences as I saw fade absolutely to nothing in comparison with the huge distinctions in which Cavor
so
it would seem the
now it's time for her
I saw were
earrings,
mostly
and I'm
engaged
put
in
gray
kindred
around her earrings.
occupations, mooncalf herds, butchers, fleshers, and the like. But within the moon, practically unsuspected
I'm gonna
by
use
me,
the
there are, it seems, a number of other sorts of selenite, differing in size, differing in the relative size of part to part, differing in power and appearance, and yet not different species of creatures, but only different forms of one species, and retaining through all their variations a certain common likeness that marks their specific unity. The moon is, indeed, a sort of vast anthill, only, instead of there being only 4 or 5 sorts of ants, there are many hundred different sorts of selenite, and almost every gradation between one sort and another. It would seem the discovery
I got 3 different color gray right here. I got one gray, gray mist, and one just regular one gray.
Under the direction of these other
so
selenites who have larger brain
I think I'm just gonna go and use the gray mist and put around her earring.
Walk even under the goad. They carried him into darkness, crossed a narrow plank-like bridge that may have been the identical bridge I had refused, and put him down in something that must have seemed at first to be some sort of lift. This was the balloon. It had certainly been absolutely invisible to us in the darkness, and what had seemed to me a mere plank walking into the void was really, no doubt, the passage of the gangway. In this he descended towards constantly more.
And now I'm gonna take the once again crazy out white. You see how this white just shrinking? This will get used the most. The white.
In a little while, the profound blackness had made his eyes so sensitive that he began to see.
Okay, so now I'm going to color her dress.
And at last the vague.
Her dress is black.
Conceive an enormous cylindrical space, says Cavor in his 7th message, a quarter of a mile across perhaps, very dimly lit at first, and then brighter, with big platforms twisting down its sides in a spiral that vanishes at last below in a blue profundity, and lit even more brightly.
And now I'm going to use the crazy art black
Think of the well
on
of the
her
very
dress.
largest spiral staircase or lift shaft that you have ever looked down.
And I'm pressing on it to get the full color of it.
Blue glass. Imagine yourself looking down that. Only imagine also that you feel extraordinarily light and have got rid of any giddy feeling you might have on earth, and you will have the first conditions of my impression. Round this enormous shaft, imagine a broad gallery running in a much steeper spiral than would be credible on Earth, and forming a steep road protected from the Gulf only by a little parapet that vanishes at last in perspective a couple of miles below. Looking up, I saw the very fellow of the downward vision. It had, of course, the effect of looking into a very steep cone. A wind was blowing down the shaft, and far above, I fancied
this is my Tamar Braxton cartoon.
The bellowing of
Tamar
the
Braxton.
that were being driven down again
Tamar.
from evening pasturage on the exterior.
Tamar. I don't know any of her music. I don't know any of her music, but I'm gonna write her name on top.
Luminous beings, regarding our appearance or busied on unknown
you know, King
errands.
David had a daughter named Tamar. She was the one that got raped. They said she was so beautiful. She wore white all the time because she was a virgin.
A little man insect clinging to a parachute drove down
No,
very swiftly
Braxton. Let's see, Braxton. Braxton.
The big-headed Selenite sitting
I hope I'm
beside
spelling it right.
Sanely moved my head with the gesture of one who saw.
But yeah, this is Tamar Braxton. I really am enjoying my audiobook. It's keeping me from really just messing up on my pictures with this whole talking thing, because I can really talk sometimes. I mean, I really can, you know.